Welcome back to Debut Writers. We're starting Series 2 today, all about creating a vision for your book. It's important to understand these things about your book as you write because it will affect your ability to market and sell books to publishers down the road.
Yes, writing a book can serve numerous purposes, both for the author and for the audience. There are several compelling reasons why someone might decide to write a book. And today we're going to talk about how you can identify your purpose for writing, why you should, and how this will help you create a vision as an author.
And I think we should start with you because your perspective on this is going to be very true. But with your first book, why, actually, with both of your books, I mean, those had two very different purposes. Can you speak a little bit to the differences and what each one, why you created that?
Yeah, so I think as writers and creatives, we all start somewhere with that first book. We have kind of that deeply personal reason we're putting it together. If you're a fiction author, nonfiction is kind of a different beast. But with A Lost Woman, that write for me was very cathartic. Like it was like writing in a journal, really, initially, getting it out of my head. And then once I wrote it, I think I talked about this in the last series. I felt like the message I had created was so powerful, and I really wanted to share that. And if my book helped one person understand the mental health behind the cycle of violence, alcoholism, and abuse within families, then I've helped one person with my book, and that would really mean a lot to me. So that kind of became my purpose behind the book. And if I didn't have that strong purpose of wanting to get that out there and have that message so other people could have that book and it could help people, I would have given up on that book a long time ago. But then The Blood Inside Me, my YA fiction series, which is completely different genre, right? Completely different writing style, everything. That came from my students that year I was teaching, and they wanted to read my book, A Lost Woman, which clearly is not for children. They were third grade. And so we started kind of develop as our writing course that year, we developed our own characters, story plot, setting, and just we were doing this big writing push in the district at that time while I was teaching. And I was co-teaching with another teacher. So I really had the time to take on the writing point process of learning with these third graders and really help them develop this story. Well, kids are relentless. Um, After that, I was badgered for 2 years to actually write the book. I mean, these students were not giving it up. They were like, Miss McDonald, where's the book? Where's the book? Can we read the book yet? Have you finished writing the book? And I'm like, because what we did in the classroom was nothing that I could put in a book, right? Like it was just us kind of like working on the components of a book and components of writing. So, but they really loved the story we developed. So they wanted me to write it. So I ended up writing it, and that was my first introduction into self-publishing because the book was never really to sell. Like, I had no intentions of selling this book or telling anybody I had written this book other than my students, but I couldn't fail them. I couldn't be that teacher that said, "I'll write this book for you," and then just never did it, right? They're in 5th grade, they're about to graduate. I finished the book probably, like, April 30th. Graduation's at the end of May, right? So I literally Googled, like, how do I get a book printed in 2 weeks? Because I was like, I need this book in 2 weeks to hand to these kids. And that's where I learned about Ingram Sparks, and I kind of dove into self-publishing, which is why I do a lot of speaking engagements on, like, the do's and don'ts of self-publishing, because I didn't know a lot when I self-published The Blood Inside Me, and now that I know what I know, I made a ton of mistakes. Really kind of detrimental mistakes because I ended up really liking the series and I'm writing the second installment now. But as much as I want that book to potentially gain more traction, there's a lot of problems with that book. And I can't now go out and try to push that book to traditional publishers because it's already published. And so lots of things about that to get us off task. But the purpose for writing those books was very different, and I had very different reasons for writing them. Now, with my third book that's in production, The Girl in the Water, that was written to establish myself as an author. Like, that's my goal with this book. It's not necessarily to sell a bunch of books or make a lot of money on it or send a message or, I'm not doing it for anybody or a legacy. This is This is my first true psychological thriller. This is the type of author I want to be. This is the pattern and consistency I want to establish as an author. So, what's really going into that book is just setting the foundation for me to write and publish a lot of books. So, that's kind of my purpose with the current book that I'm writing. So, there can be tons of different reasons authors decide to write a book.
So many. And one thing that I want to touch on with everything that you said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you knew your vision and you knew your purpose early on. And
Yes.
I think that that is a crucial element
Mhm.
to this entire process is knowing what that purpose is early in the process. Like not deciding it down the road or, when your manuscript is finished, but knowing your vision really at the beginning.
Well, what this vision is going to translate into is your marketing strategy. So, this vision is gonna turn into, does an agent pick you up or not? Does a publisher pick you up or not? How does the publisher market that book? So, this vision is really important. And if you don't have a good understanding of what your vision is for this book before you start writing it, you can find yourself spending time writing a book that never goes anywhere. You see authors all the time putting books back on the shelf, like it just didn't work out because you didn't realize what you were trying to do with the book, and now you're trying to force the book into something it was never written for, in my opinion. And so then it's like, but if you know that and you know what your purpose is for this book, then as you're writing the book, you just kind of keep that in the back of your mind the whole time. So you stay on track and you don't get unfocused. And the book doesn't kind of go a different turn to where now it's unmarketable or it's just not who you want to be as an author. I've had authors asked me before, one just the other day on a call, I've got a second book. Should I really put anything into this first book? Because it's already published. She wants to republish it with us. Should I even try, or should I just move on to the second book? And I'm like, well, it depends. Is your first book helping your second book? Like with A Lost Woman, it doesn't sit in that psychological thriller genre as much as I'd want it to. It's more domestic suspense and women's fiction. So when I got the opportunity to republish that with Indigo River, I declined because I was like, it's just not really where I want to sit as an author. Like I love that book. It had its own purpose, it has its own mission, but it's not really who I am as an author or who I want to be as an author. A Girl in the Water is though. So I gave them A Girl in the Water and they accepted that. And so now we're moving forward with that book. So but I hear it all the time. I mean, authors putting books away. A good friend of ours, Jenny, she was just telling us about how her first book was not the book she started with. And so she ended up writing a whole second book. And then that book got picked up by Penguin Random House. She got an amazing agent with that book, but she had a great vision. She knew what that book's purpose was. And it made all the difference for her.
And then I'll add too, she was able to come back to that initial story and turn that into a different book. So she sort of used it as a foundation later on when it was a little bit more appropriate, when she could develop the vision for what that next one was going to be with that early foundation that she had. And when it comes to your purpose too, this is so closely linked to everything we said about knowing your why. Knowing your why and creating your vision for your book specifically, that ultimately is going to fuel your entire process. And like we've talked about, this is a marathon. It is not a sprint. And so when you recognize that and know that there's a lot of strategy behind it and being strategic about it is going to help you with the whole process, then I think you're going to feel a lot more comfortable with it. And when you do hit those roadblocks and those bumps, then ultimately your vision is going to be what helps you climb those mountains and cross those hurdles. So those are some of the reasons that we want to spend this time talking about how important your vision is. So a couple of questions that we think you can focus on that Anne was just speaking to. One of them is, why are you writing this book for you? And again, that's diving into that passion that you have specifically for your story. But then here's the flip side that I think people miss is, why are you writing this book for a reader? Who is your ideal reader? Do you
Mhm.
have a target audience? because that truly, truly matters.
It does, because when I finished A Lost Woman, I'm like, "Genre? It fit into nothing." And so it domestic suspense, but it was like, that's only a genre to some people, like, you can't always pick that one, and I really learned this during my first pitch event on Twitter. It was like, "You're supposed to hashtag your genres," and none of them fit my book, and I was like, "Oh, Christmas." Like, that's I kinda mugged that one up. And so I didn't have like I had the purpose for writing the book, but I didn't necessarily have the vision for what type of reader I was writing that book for. It was just purely for myself. And I had to make changes to that book to help it be more reader centric. And so that is something to definitely consider when you're thinking, okay, what's my purpose? And then why would somebody read this book? And will this book help people? Will this book, what will this book give people? What makes you the right person to write this story? That's another big one too. So, Brie, I don't know if you asked this like when you're author coaching and an author's like, I want to write a book about blah blah blah. Okay, why you? Like what makes you special?
Oh, it absolutely does. And sometimes people have excellent answers to that, and sometimes they don't. But you're making me think. So, all of that, let me kind of rewind a little bit too. Is so one of the authors that I've been working with has this manuscript. I think the book has a lot of potential, but to your point, I go, where do you want this book to sit? Where do you as an author feel like you want to sit? I know you're working on some other things. Ultimately, what's your goal? And we've been working now for a long time because he doesn't know. And so that's very clear then in this main manuscript that I've been helping him with, where the book essentially has an identity crisis because
I like that.
he he didn't have a vision for it, and now trying to rework all of that when you don't know ultimately what your goal is. um, that's going to come across in the writing, and the readers are going to have a hard time either relating to it or getting a message from all of that. So you do need to identify what you want, that where you want that to sit. And my advice would also be, and this isn't 100% true all of the time, but think about what you like to read, and ultimately, do you want to write something similar to that? Many authors like to write what they read, and I think their writing is often better for it.
Yes, I think, in our first series, we talked about, creating that author vision. So, like, that plays a lot into now creating that vision for your first book. Is it supporting your author vision? Are they on the same page? Because that's going to be really important, the kind of author that you want to be and where you want to be as an author. That first book is like you're coming out. It's like down here in the South, what do we have? Debutante. It's like your debutante where like you're really it's your introduction into the reader society. And if you don't do that the right way, if you don't have a true purpose kind of behind you to set yourself apart, that could lead to problems down the road. It could lead to your book really struggling.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of the key purposes, or some of the main purposes that people do write books, because there's a range and we're not going to cover all of them, but what are some of the reasons for writing or for a story?
Well, so you have nonfiction, which is a lot easier to determine, right? Like, are
So much
you
easier.
educating people? Are you informing them of something, persuading them, sharing like a new theory or idea or something? Are you supporting the business and that kind of stuff? Are you just trying to set yourself as an expert in that space? So then people come and seek your services over the other person because you wrote a book. So clearly you know what you're talking about. I love how people do that. But so nonfiction, there can be a lot of reasons that you're writing the book to kind of get a message out there, get people to come to you as clients, right? Versus fiction, are you entertaining? Are you trying to bring light to social issues? My wife, Fantasy the Blood Inside Me, unbeknownst to me when I was writing it, So if I had known this while I was writing it, I probably could have done a much better job at highlighting this throughout the book. But it does kind of target social issues of racism. And so in its own like fantasy way. And when I got to the end of the book, that's when I had my aha moment about that. And I was like, oh, well, that could have done that better. Um, so it's like, man, but my ultimate goal is to go back and rewrite that book once I finish the second book and like have a completed series and just redo the whole thing, FYI. But so it's one of those things where it's like, are you, with that fiction novel, is there a deeper, more resonating issue that you can bring to light that you can focus on with that book? Because you're gonna want to know that as your book writes and matures. Because if it's a big message like that, like with the A Lost Woman, the message was, how do you break the cycle of violence when it's just embedded in your family for generations? How do you get out of that? And so that was really the big message. So that was the purpose for writing that. So, and even if your strictly purpose is, I just want to entertain people, I just want to write a story about dragons, awesome. I think there is no writer out there that just strictly writes to entertain, just to tell this story. There is always underlining messages. There is always underlining social issues that you can bring to light. And I honestly think it makes a book more powerful and more interesting to people. So uh, definitely consider that when you're looking at your story.
Absolutely. I would argue that without some sort of message, big or small, your book is ultimately going to lack structure and character development. And ultimately those are a lot of reasons that people read. They want a good story. Typically they want to connect with at least one of the characters, if not more. And even if it is an epic fantasy, which if you've listened to any episode, I'm a big fan of, but there are other messages there in the midst of all that adventure. You're so connected to their story and the path that they're on, the trials that they're going to overcome. I love the dragons. Throw in a good dragon and those are awesome, but there needs to be some more development there with the plot and with the characters as well. Otherwise, a lot of people really aren't going to connect with it, not to sound harsh, but I think that we're in the business of needing to be a little bit honest about what
Yeah.
that really looks like.
Well, and on our last episode, writing your story with the wonderful Deb Phrase, check it out if you haven't seen it. It was an extremely informative episode.
So
But
good.
she talks a lot about that, about how that's some really common mistakes she sees is lack of character development, lack of plot, lack of purpose. All these things come through in your writing. And so I read, I read a lot of submissions. And so I also deal with kind of, if the purpose of the book is unknown, it tends to be very repetitive in a bad way. Like you're repeating stuff, but it doesn't make sense and connect with the other stuff you just said because you're just kind of rambling at this point. So that's a problem too.
And I would add, in the coaching or the editing process, it is so much easier to work with an author coach or editor, likely multiple editors. If you know your purpose, people can help you with that. And you just say, okay, well, this character, they lack this, or the message isn't really coming through. You're not sure, all of those different things. It is a lot easier. But if I can turn to an author and say, why did you write this book?
Mhm.
And they know right away, you can work with that. There
Yes.
is a lot that you can do to ultimately make that story better. But if you're looking at a manuscript and you say to the author, okay, why did you write this? And they don't really know. It's extremely difficult from the coaching and editing standpoint to try to bring that out of them. There are a lot of questions and there are things to talk through to try to help with that, but you really do need a strong foundation. And I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but nobody can really tell you what your goals should be. They can
Mhm.
give you, the different paths, But you have to know that, and this sounds cheesy, but you have to know that within yourself to
Mhm.
ultimately have that conveyed through your writing.
Yeah, I do these book building sessions. It's like an hour of my time, and I help authors create like a really solid book proposal. It's a lot with nonfiction authors mostly because I meet with a lot of authors who have great visions and great ideas, but they're kind of um, they're just kind of all over the place. And so I always say, like, I can talk to somebody for 30 minutes and I can tell you what your book's going to be about. And I love this. This is like, it's like a fun party game for me. I like meet people and I'm like, I talk to them for 30 minutes. I'm like, have you ever written a book about? Because that's your book. You should write that.
That is your party trick.
But with these book proposal, like building guides, I remember talking to this author one time and he was like, talking about a chapter outline. He's like, this chapter and that chapter, that then I would want to talk about that. And it was kind of all over the place. And I was having a hard time understanding the purpose of the vision behind this book. And then all of a sudden, it through all the talking, it clicked in my mind. I was like, wait a minute. I was like, so we're talking about the mental health of people in the sports industry. And we came up with the title like After the Whistle Blew. And in that moment, it was like this book has an incredible purpose because my kids are huge sports fans. We watch a lot of football, baseball, all that stuff. You throw an interception and it's done. There's no going back. There's no rewind. You can't like be like, oh, wait a minute. Can I redo that throw that didn't count? Like, no, you just threw an interception and lost the Super Bowl. Like it's over. And how do you mentally come back from that? And that's what that purpose of the book became. That's what he wanted to convey. And amongst all the stuff he had been talking about and saying, I was like, that's your purpose. And once we targeted that, all that outline just fell into place and all that other stuff could be deleted and canceled and reorganized in such an amazing way. So it was like finding his purpose completely made that book, and it's going to be a phenomenal book. I'm just saying.
And so on that note, if you, let's say you have a manuscript right now and you're like, it's done, it's ready to go to the next stage, but think about that for a second. Do you have a purpose and a vision for that book? And then I would say, if you don't, do not be afraid to identify that and delete the
Yeah.
stuff that no longer serves. Your book will be so much better for it. I know how hard it is when all of a sudden you are erasing an entire chapter and you think, oh my goodness, all that time. But ultimately, you want it to be the best it can be. So do not be afraid to get rid of
I
those
was
words
just
that don't move your
yeah.
story forward.
I was just editing this guy's book and I cut 20,000 words from his book. Whole chapters. I'd read the chapter like no reason for this. Delete. So it was like
Yeah. Do
you probably
not
got
be
the book
afraid.
back. It was like this is a butcher job, which it was. I mean, it was a complete butchering of his book. But it's a lot better in my opinion.
Yeah. No, do not be afraid. It's hard, but do not be afraid to do that. And if you're not at that stage, if you're still in these early stages of developing your book, then now is the time to start figuring out that purpose. We gave you some questions that you can ask yourself, maybe brainstorm with someone else, have another person ask you, why you want to write your book and listen to what you say.
Yeah.
What I think that's a really really great way to ultimately bring those words out of you if you're struggling sitting in your office by yourself identifying what you want that purpose to be. Just have a friend or spouse or partner or anyone ask the question to you and answer it out loud.
I
What are
think
some
another
other,
big
yeah, I was going to say other tips.
I yeah, I think another big thing would be to, if you have a favorite author, like go and do a little research on that author to figure out why they wrote their first book. It'll be out there. I mean, if it's an old author or an author that's been around for a long time, maybe not so much, but there's authors have to do so much promotion now and they have to be out there so much doing media to get attention on their book that you really should, if they're a recent author, you really should be able to find an article or interview or something to where they're talking about, this is the reason I wrote my first book, this is why I wanted to be a writer, this is what I love the most. Like these are also interview questions that you will get one day.
Yes, and you'll want to be prepared to answer them. So I think that this is a really solid start to this second series of debut writers, all about creating a vision for your book. And next week, we are going to dive into knowing your goal. And I'm so excited to talk about this. I think it is a really nice segue and an appropriate time to think when you're in these early stages of your book.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Debut Writers. Make sure to check out our newsletter for your 3 T's and subscribe to never miss an empowering conversation.
Stay inspired and keep writing.